Hello, my name is Jim Cotton. I'm a member of the 388th Bomb Group, and I was in the 563rd Squadron, and I served as a navigator on the B-17 bomber Hell's Bells. And I want to let you know how I started out and got involved in something like this. The war broke out in December, obviously, 1941. But I was only about 16 then, so when I became 18 in 1943, I was still in high school, hadn't finished. I was a senior though, and so I decided I wanted to go in and help out. So I went down to Bolling Air Force Base in Washington, D.C., and told them I wanted to sign up for the United States U.S. Air Corps, the Army Air Corps. And the guy said, fine. So he said, I'll have to give you an exam. So he gave me a physical. And during the physical, I weighed 125 pounds. And he said, I'm sorry, sir, you have to weigh 130. So I recommend you go home and eat all the bananas you can for 3 weeks. And then come back and I'll see what we can do for you. So I did that, and I came back and weighed 128 pounds. So he said, go out in the hall and drink all the water you can. So I went out in the hall and drank until I was about ready to drown. I came back in, got on the scale, weighed 131. He says, fine, you're in. So here I was in the U.S. Army Air Corps. So I went in and they sent me to basic training down in Greensboro, North Carolina. It was real rough. We had a tough sergeant there, and he worked us over good. We had extended marches with our gas masks on and things like that. But I was a young kid, and I put up with it. That lasted about a month, and this was in August 1943. From there, they sent me up to the University of Minnesota, where I was to get what they called College Training Detachment. And they gave us regular college subjects. We stayed in the football stadium at the university, and we had like triple, quadruple bunk beds in the locker rooms where the football players dress up. And it was interesting because I sent these college credits to my high school later. I got 18 college credits, and I sent them to my high school, and they said, this is enough to give you your high school diploma. So they mailed me my high school diploma, and it turns out that the graduation for that was in June of 1944, and I was overseas then. So they sent me a letter saying, since you don't plan to be here for the graduation, you won't have to rent a cap and gown. I always regret not saving that letter, framing it, and putting it on the wall. So after I got through the college training up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and it was pretty cold up there, they gave me 10 hours of flight training in a Taylor Cub, and it was like 15 below zero while we were up flying, and I wasn't used to that kind of cold. But anyway, my feet were frozen and everything else. And I went through that flight training and then went down to Santa Ana, California, which is a place that they designated as a pre-flight type of thing. This is where you got all these, they call them psychomotor tests. Here's where they found out what capabilities you would have and whether you should be a navigator, bombardier, or a pilot. Of course, I wanted to be a pilot, but that was not too relevant, my desires. So I took the test, and turned out I got a 9 in navigator and bombardier and an 8 in pilot. So they said, we want you as a navigator. So I accepted that, and they sent me to Hondo, Texas, where I went through navigation training school. And in, I arrived in Hondo about sometime in August. And I remember getting off the train, and it was so hot, I thought my clothes were going to burst into flames. course, he didn't. And I went through the navigation school, did very well, got high grades, ended up, in fact, I did get higher grades later. I graduated as a second lieutenant rather than a flight officer. Some of those that were graduating were made flight officers, which is, of course, a little downgrade from a second lieutenant. And so they sent me to Gulfport, Mississippi, which is where I joined up with the crew that I ended up going over to Europe, to Netashall, the bomb, the 388th Bomb Group. And this is where I met Joe Douglas, the pilot, and Draper, the co-pilot, and DePorsic was the engineer, Flynn was the radio operator, Rush Urell was the tail gunner, and Bertram was the belly gunner. And I can't forget it. We had one waist gunner, because by that time, see, this was near the end of the war. This was back in early '45, and so they originally had two waist gunners, but when I went over there, they used the radio operator as the second waist gunner. So when combat started, he just left his radio, because it was radio silence anyway, so he didn't have anything to do. So we ended up flying 9 missions from Netashall, and after the 9 missions, the Germans heard I was there, so they surrendered. This was sometime in June. But in those missions, I remember one we went out on, it was April 10th, '45, and the Germans were, number of their fighters and all was reduced, but they decided to make one last ditch attempt at knocking out more B-17s in the 8th Air Force, so they sent up every single fighter plane, FW-190s and ME-110s, and even sent up some ME-210s, which were jets. I remember one going right underneath our B-17. There was discussions about the Germans starting to ram our planes like the Japanese, but from my point of view, because we had a ME-109 come right across our tail, the tail gunner said when the ME-110 came by, he could see the pilot slumped over, so he knew that he was dead and wasn't controlling the ME-210. It went right behind our tail and hit the B-17 right next to us at the radio room and cut it right in half. And I followed the tail section, the elevators and the rudder and part of the fuselage as it spun down towards Earth, hoping to see some chutes come out, but I guess the fact that the centrifugal force kept them from getting out and getting their chutes on, which is what we all had to do if anything happened. You didn't have your chute on, you had to put it on and then find an exit. And I followed the other section, the wing section, which spun. They had part of the body left in the wing, and it went all the way down and it crashed, and nobody bailed out of it, so I felt pretty bad about that. And I remember how well the P-51s protected us, because I vividly remember 2 ME-109s starting to make a run on our group, because it was known that the Germans would fly down the whole line of the 8th Air Force bombing, and if they saw a group with loosely assembled planes, they would attack that group, because it was easier for them to get in and out without getting hit. But we were pretty tight. The colonel of the base stressed that. And so as soon as those ME-110 started turning, here comes this P-51 guy off from the right, and those 2 guys just ran, flew away like they were scared rabbits. So I knew how good they were defending us, because they went all the way to the target with us, and as many people know, the P-47 had a shorter range, and it had to turn around after so long, and the V-17s went into the target without any air cover. And that's when most of the attrition took place. There was a lot of flak on every one of the targets we went into. And I remember one vividly going into Nuremberg. Our 563rd Squadron and the other two and the 3rd Bomb Group were heading in to bomb, I think it was railroad yards on the outskirts of Nuremberg. And the groups in front of us, you could just see the flak just all through there, and B-17s getting hit and going down. And so it was obvious that the pilots in our group thought, that's nonsense, we're not going through there. So as soon as the bombardier released the bombs, the lead guy and everybody else dropped their bombs based on his lead, the planes just turned on their wings just as sharp as they could to the right. The whole group did that without anybody crashing into each other. To me, it was miraculous. And of course, this took us out of the range of the flak, so none of our planes got hit. And I guess another incident which I had, which is interesting, was the fact that on one mission, the weather was socked in all the way from the ground up to 25,000 feet, which meant the pilots were all told, as soon as you left the ground, you were socked in. Everybody was to fly over France from their base at Nettachal and get over 25,000 feet and then assemble into your group for going into the target. So we broke out of clouds at 25,000 feet, and I was navigating the pilot to the location where the rendezvous was. We arrived there with all the planes circling around, forming the squadrons and the whole group. So I thought, well, I've done my job. I got the pilot here, so I sat down and didn't bother looking at anything. Well, about a half an hour later, I looked up and there wasn't any planes around. It was just, the skies were empty. And to this day, I regret not asking the pilot, why didn't you just start assembling with that group of planes instead of keeping going? Well, luckily, he kept on the same heading. Well, here we were all by ourselves out there, very vulnerable to fighters because they like, single B-17s flying by themselves. And so I just, with dead reckoning, I told the pilot to turn left and fly so long, and then on my map, I reached the point where the whole 388 was heading into the target. So then I had him turn left again, figuring that we would face the 388 heading into us. And sure enough, here comes the 388 group heading right into us. And that was dangerous too, because a lot of times the Germans would have a captured B-17, and they would try and fly up and pull in with a group heading for the target. So there was always the danger that with us coming up by ourselves like that was the danger of us getting shot by all the gunners on the B-17s in the 388. But we ended up losing one of our engines. Started pouring oil out of it. So the pilot had to cut the engine. See, we were up around 28,000 feet, so it obviously is stressing the engines. So the pilot feathered that engine, and so when we got to the group, since we only had 3 engines, we wouldn't have the airspeed to stay with the group. So Joe, the pilot, decided, I'm going to have to take us back. So we went back and released the bombs over the English Channel, so we wouldn't have the bomb load when we landed, and we went ahead and landed at the field. That went until June, I guess, whenever I was still in the squadron, when the Germans surrendered. And then they decided to send us back to the States. And me personally, they told me, we're going to send you back and train you as a navigator in B-29s to bomb the Japanese. So they allowed us to take the same B-17, which was brand new, and we brought it over. And even though we were in all that combat with fighters and flak and everything, that B-17 was like it was brand new. There wasn't a hole in it anywhere, which I always consider good guardian angels. So we brought the B-17 back by way of the Azores Islands out in the Atlantic. And when we got there, we were supposed to fly up to Newfoundland, but the wind speed was too great from the west. So we'd be heading into a headwind the whole way back, and they warned all the pilots that it was too dangerous, that you'd probably not make it. So we stayed there for like 3 days. But one B-24 pilot, he decided he was going to try. See, they had a little more range than we did, and he thought he would decide to go back. So he went all by himself. And unfortunately, he ran out of gas. And believe it or not, this guy ditched his plane in the middle of the Atlantic after dark and without breaking it up, and a rescue boat came and picked up all that whole crew and saved every one of them. So when I got back to the States, I went to Bolling Air Force Base after a 30-day delay en route, hitched a ride on a B-25 out to Kansas City, and then that's as far as it was going. So then I went to flight headquarters, and I ended up getting on a C-47 up to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which is where I was going to be training in B-29s. When I got up there, when I was in Omaha, Nebraska, that's when the Japs surrendered. This was August 15th, 1945. The place was madhouse. It was a madhouse. Wow, everybody running all over the streets, and gals running around kissing soldiers on the street and all this kind of stuff. So now the war was over, so when I ended up hitching this ride up to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, they had a whole bunch of guys on their hands. What are we going to do with them? So they ended up, would you like to be our skeet range officer? Fine, that sounds like a nice job. So I ended up being able to call up the motor pool, get a whack to get a staff, one of those staff cars they drove around, take the officer, it was only officers that I took out there, not enlisted men, and let them shoot skeet. And so I could see a lot of jackrabbits in the fields as we drove towards the skeet range. And I asked the enlisted woman that was driving the car if she'd stop. So she stopped, and I got out with my 12-gauge shotgun, 7-shot repeater, believe it or not, and shot me a couple pheasant, threw them in the trunk of the car, and when it was over, before that, I had talked to a farmer that owned this huge area, square miles of land. And I went up and asked him, I said, is it all right if I shoot jackrabbits on your land? Because I see an awful lot of them. He said, kill all you want, they're eating my crops. So I used to go out with my shotgun and shoot these jackrabbits that had ears like this. They were huge. So I had a lot of fun being skeet range officer. But that same day I took back the pheasant to the mess hall, went to the chef and said, can you cook these up for me? Not a problem. So he cooked them up, and I sat all by myself in the kitchen feasting on these pheasant. Anyway, in November 11th of 1945, they gave me my discharge, and I returned home and went to the VA to get my veterans benefits, which was college training, give me a college degree. And they said, yeah, you can start school in January. It's halfway through, but there's a lot of veterans that are going to be start, so they're going to set up a program where you can do the whole college thing in 3.5 years. So they gave me a battery of tests. They said, we recommend that you be take an aeronautical engineering course. So I signed up and took 2 years of the class, and then the VA called me in and said, there aren't many jobs out there in the aeronautical engineering field. We suggest you switch to mechanical engineering. So I did, and in June of 1949, I graduated as an engineer. That year, there was very few jobs for engineers, so a lot of my buddies in the class ended up being car salesmen, and one guy went and became an engineer in a power plant. He was operating the big boilers and stuff like that. I ended up being very lucky. I applied for a job in the government with the Navy Department, Bureau of Ships. Got the phone call, went in and interviewed this guy who was the only man in the whole Bureau of Ships that did the cost estimating of the Navy ships. That the estimates would go to Congress and they'd appropriate the funds for the building of the ships. After about 6 months, he went on vacation out in Kansas, and while he was out there, his car crashed into a cow, and in the accident, he broke his hip. So here he was stuck out in Kansas with a broken hip, and here I am, a junior engineer, being head of this cost estimating department. And so I ended up really learning the business from the ground up, all by myself. I ended up being the guy in Bureau ships and in the Navy, actually, for estimating these ships. I even had a chance to have personal interviews with Admiral Rickover when it came to pricing out the first nuclear submarine. And so it worked out that I would go to meetings with Navy captains and commanders and all this there, and an admiral would be the head guy running the meeting, and they'd come up with subject of cost. And some of these naval officers would start spouting off, and the admiral would say, I want to tell you guys, the only guy in this room at this meeting that has anything to say about cost is Jim Cotton. So I felt like, man, what a big shot I am. So this went on for years. No matter where I would go, I would end up being the guy. I'd go over and brief guys on the Hill, and I'll tell you, it ended up, my wife, I've always told my wife how I loved my job. Every day I loved going to work because it was so exciting and it was something different every day. And so I worked there for, I guess it was 13 years. And I was supposed to get a promotion from a GS-13 to a 14, but an admiral, I guess he was the deputy chief of the Bureau of Ships, he decided they were promoting too many civilians. So he said to all of the divisions and everything, withdraw all your promotions for civilians. We're going to start them all over again. So mine was one of them that was withdrawn. At the same time, I was being wanted by the Institute for Defense Analysis. This was a think tank that did systems analysis for the Office of Secretary of Defense. So when they turned down my promotion, I went to these guys and said, yeah, I'll work for you, not knowing what I was getting into or anything. So I went to work for them for 3 years, and then there was another place, another think tank called the Center for Naval Analysis, and they did all of the systems analysis for the Navy Department. So they made me an offer, and I turned it down. So a year later, they came back and had increased their offer, so I finally accepted and went to work for them. And I worked for them for like 13 and a half years. And in 1978, I think it was, I decided, well, I got 17 years with a think tank. Why don't I go back into the government and increase my high 3 salary, which is important back in those days because your retirement was based on the average of your salaries over all those years, which is a smart thing. So I ended up going back to Navy, Bureau of Ships, where I used to work, and asked them if I could get a job. And of course they said sure, and they hired me back as a GS-14. So I worked for them for, let's see, I guess it was about 12 years to get my 30 years in. And they gave me, I ended up getting a GS-15 and retired as one in 1989. 1989, I retired. Well, wait a minute, I'm skipping the point where I met my wife, which is very important. My brother, how much time have I got? Keep going. My brother was a law student at Georgetown University, and there was a dance in the area for all Catholic colleges. You could not bring a date, and it was at the gymnasium on the Catholic University grounds. So I didn't want to go, but my younger brother twisted my arm and got me to go, because I was then, working for the Navy Department. I had everything I wanted. There was no reason for me. And I really wasn't that interested. I wasn't a girl chaser, so. But I decided to go. I went to the dance, and I was sitting there talking to my wife then. My wife, it became my wife, her sister, who I knew from other parties, because she was older. I'm about 5.5 years older than my wife, so I was dating these older girls. And sitting there talking to her, and my wife, Joyce, she came up and sat down at the table. Her sister introduced me, and I asked her if she wanted to dance. It was the last dance of the whole thing for the night. So we went out on a dance floor. Turns out when I got out of the service, my brother and I went to Arthur Murray's and took dance lessons. And Joyce had already taken dance lessons too. So when we went out on a dance floor, it was like we'd been dancing together all our lives. But it wasn't love at first sight, far from it. And we went through some struggling times. I took her out on a date. The first date I had with her, we went to see a movie called Mrs. Miniver, and it was a very tear-jerky one. And my wife hears crying during this movie, and I thought, do I want to date a girl like this? So I didn't call her up again. And then, so it turns out she had a group. She was going to Trinity College. She was a junior at Trinity College, which is right near Catholic University in Washington, about maybe a mile away. And so she invited me to one of her parties, which was a party out at the Officers Club in Bethesda Naval Hospital. Turns out that one of the ladies that was there, one of the girls that was there with her, for some reason wasn't speaking to Joyce. So the two of them ended up sitting next to each other and saying nothing all night. And so I thought, I don't want to have anything to do with this gal. She has no personality. Luckily, she had a party at the school where they had to call up and make a date and bring them. So I said, okay. So I went to the went to the party, and she was a live wire. She was with her friends and everything else. And then one thing led to another, and so we ended up, liking each other, and one thing led to another. And so I ended up asking her to marry me. And then her father says, you all can't get married until you graduate from college. Well, I said that was fine. So a year and a half later, we ended up getting married. And to make a long story short, we ended up having 7 children. And we've got 16 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. And here I am, 87 years old, happy as a lark, married to the most beautiful girl in the world. And that's really the history of Jim Cotton, a member of the 388th Bomb Group. Thank you. I just remembered I'm Jim Cotton again, and I just remembered some things that I thought might be interesting to you, that I was reminded by my wife, and I think they are three pieces of information. The first one is that I ended up being, as I told you, the one guy that was in charge of making cost estimates for the Navy Department. And of course, one of the jobs I had was estimating the first nuclear submarine. And in order to price that submarine out, there was a lot of technical information which, to make my estimate complete, I could do the frames and all that structure, but there was a lot of like nuclear reactors and other stuff that was needed on the submarine. And it was the very first one in the history of nuclear submarines. So we ended up, my boss and I went over and contacted Admiral Rickover, who was the Mr. Submarine, nuclear submarines. And the neat thing about it was that this was the early days of Admiral Rickover. And I was fortunate enough to be able to meet with him when he was a very jovial, non-strict admiral. So we had a very cordial conversation with him. I learned later that he became about as hard an admiral or any naval officer as he could possibly be. He got his people to man, the different naval officers, to man each nuclear submarine which he had built, and the Navy built, and got out into the fleet. He would call in the various, they were usually ranks like a commander, and he would call them in for the interview, and his technique for testing how good they were was it would be a one-on-one situation with the officer facing Rickover, and he would put them in a chair where they had removed one of the legs. So it was only a three-legged chair. He wanted to make them as uneasy and as uncomfortable as they could be, because he wanted to see how well they acted in stressful situations, which he knew they would be faced with when they became an officer operating these nuclear submarines at sea. And I've talked to many of the commanders about how uncomfortable they were sitting in this three-legged chair and trying to keep it from falling over and still, respond to the admiral's questions. So it was really interesting how he changed from the first moment when my boss and I met with him, because he really wasn't famous then. He became famous because of his connections to the nuclear fleet, and then how he changed over the years. But I understood it. People thought he was terrible and a monster and all this, which people told me. But I felt that he was really, it was beneficial to the officers that he was interviewing, as well as to him being able to evaluate how well they did or didn't do. I'd like to also give you some other information which I was reminded of, which is very interesting. When the war ended, the Germans had flooded Holland, and the people were starving. They had no food, and so what they did, asked us to bring them food over. So the ground people would bundle up these packages of food. It was probably a size of maybe 4 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet. It was a block. And we would open up our bomb bay doors, and the ground crew would load these into the bomb bay. And then we flew from our base at Netteshaw about 50 feet off the ground over the English Channel and we kind of had to raise up to get on when we hit the land, and then we flew along to the airfield that was over there that wasn't underwater. And the neat thing about it was that clear as a bell, the Dutch people had planted tulips on the ground big enough for us to see, and the tulips said, "Thanks, Yanks." And it was very emotional to see that, and very rewarding, and made us feel good. And so we dropped our food, and the things would, if we were too high, the food stuff would break open, but it really didn't damage, what was inside. They had to just run around and pick up the parts. Then they said, "We want you to go over to Linz, Austria. There's a whole bunch of French prisoners of war that, of course, have been released now that the war's over, and we'd like to bring them back to Paris." So we flew over and landed in Linz, Austria, and picked up, they knew how many, well, of course we knew how many people we could get on the B-17 without making it unstable. So I ended up with like 2 or 3 French guys sitting up in the nose of the plane, which is where I was all the time. And on the way back, they spoke French and I spoke English. I kept trying to tell them that we're taking you to Paris, home. And they looked at me like, they didn't understand a word I was saying. So finally I thought to myself, why don't you say, "We're bringing you back to Paris"? And those guys went wild. "Oh, we're going to Paris!" So they were happy then from all the way back. And then we landed and we let them out, and they all went on their way. And people were standing all around. It was quite an exciting environment there. So after we dropped them off, we just flew on back to our base. And I guess that's about all the other exciting things that I did other than the combat missions. So I hope you've enjoyed the life of Jim Cotton from beginning to end, and I hope you enjoy this. Thank you. Goodbye.